Hello everyone. Before this video gets properly started, I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that there are time codes in the video description below so that you can jump ahead to whichever part of this conversation is most relevant to your interests. Otherwise, if you want to watch from beginning to end, we start with an overview of Louise de Vilmorin as a person as well as a poet, and we follow that up with an in-depth look at each poem found in the Fiançailles pour rire. I hope you enjoy.
Pieds nus.
Oui.
So, hello, Dr. Colombat.
Hello, Dr. Colombat.
We're here today to talk about the poems of Louise de Vilmorin and the music of Francis Poulenc. The reason I'm especially excited to talk to you about it is because of your relation to Louise de Vilmorin as a person with a literary background rather than a musical background. I think a lot of musicians are familiar with the Fiançailles pour rire. They're certainly familiar with Francis Poulenc. They may be familiar with French poetry from the early part of the 20th century. So de Vilmorin is kind of on the edge of what a musician might know. And we have you here today to talk about this personality, this creative person, this historical figure, this cultural icon from a literary perspective. So thanks so much for your time and your research that we have prepared here. And let's get right into it. So coming from a literary perspective, who is Madame Louise de Vilmorin?
Okay, so Madame de Vilmorin is very interesting as a writer because she never meant to be a writer in the beginning. She loved painting, and actually she saw herself as a painter when she started. And she was good friends with Jean Hugo, who was a socialite painter, very famous person in high society in Paris, a descendant of Victor Hugo. She was hosting a lot of people of the French Parisian high society in her chateau on Sunday afternoon and for her dinners on Sunday. One of her good friends at that time, André Malraux, noticed that she wrote some poems every now and then. And André Malraux, who was one of her famous fiancés, André Malraux was famous because he had gotten the Prix Goncourt already at that time. So he was a leading literary figure in Paris, and he was very attached to Louise de Vilmorin for a short while as a lover. Anyway, he's the one who convinced her to write poetry and to become a writer rather than a painter. And she trusted him because he was a good friend and they loved each other. And she said, okay, and she gave it a try. And she started sending him her poetry, and he said, this is good, you should keep going, keep writing. And then she became a poet. So Louise de Vilmorin is that kind of a writer. And what is odd is she had nothing to do with the avant-garde literary scene at that time in Paris. She had nothing to do with the existentialists, the surrealists, all these leading intellectuals in Paris. She did her own kind of literature. So she was a very independent woman. She didn't like feminism at all. She didn't like any kind of ideology. Okay. So that's the kind of poet she was. She was a very, very good poet.
Do you think that had anything to do with her aristocratic background? This kind of distancing from ideology of,
yes, she was,
especially revolutionary ideologies?
She was well educated, and she came from a very wealthy French family with a very aristocratic name, and her family became extremely wealthy with the seed business. And the seed business, they were selling seeds.
Okay.
And France is the leading agricultural country in Europe, and was for a long time. So they made a fortune selling seeds. So she never needed to work. She was not a snob. She was not putting down anyone. Mm-hmm. She loved being surrounded with people. She loved being loved. She had
Mm-hmm.
a great desire of seducing. She needed to seduce people, and so she was a very endearing person, and she was a wonderful hostess, and people loved her for who she was.
Right. I kind of see Louise de Vilmorin as one of the final chapters of this French tradition of wealthy, aristocratic, or at least very affluent women
Yes.
who, in Paris, who surrounded themselves with very great artists or just about anybody. I mean,
Yes.
this goes back to like the Countess Belgioso in the 1830s, or Gertrude Stein.
So she certainly belonged to that tradition of salon. But there are salons, and but her salon, yes, she is definitely a brilliant, well-educated woman who had a wealth and used her wealth to gather around her artists and to support artists of all kinds, popular artists, more esoteric artists, people like Poulenc, but also popular singers like Guy Béard, who was on TV with his guitar all the time,
Sure.
and very different from Poulenc.
Sure.
So she
But also
invited-
someone like, Malraux and
and
Saint-Exupéry.
Malraux and Saint-Exupéry, yes.
So-
She surrounded herself with, very interesting artists, all kinds. There was a great diversity of people around her. And she was people loved her because she paid attention to every person. People said, she really takes the time to know me, and to when she invited somebody at her Sunday dinners. So she was very, very endearing. Yeah.
So these Sunday dinners also, as we start slowly turning our attention towards the Fiançailles pour rire, these Sunday dinners were one of her big things, right?
Right, and that was a tradition, and there were some very influential people at those dinners, definitely, who were in government, in arts and culture, and leading figures in Paris. Her salon was outside of Paris, so that was not, it was in her chateau in Verrières-le-Buisson, family castle, where she had the famous blue salon. Everything was blue there, with beautiful blue candles and blue furniture and beautiful, table sets and all that. So the blue salon was quite famous. But she disliked anything that had to do with ideology or, very different from Sartre at the same time, was writing and...
Or somebody like Éluard.
Or Éluard, or the
Right.
surrealists who were connected to Marxism and ideology and the revolution. Very different groups, very different kinds of salons, if you can refer to the surrealists as their own, having their own revolutionary salon, or the existentialists having their own kind of salon, their own team.
Right. Like your mother, for instance, knew of Louise de Vilmorin.
Yes, so my mother knew Louise de Vilmorin. My mother had nothing to do with the aristocracy. My mother was a very, working class, lower middle class person. Louise de Vilmorin represented a smart woman who was very elegant, very stylish, always very well dressed, very involved in the fashion world as well. Louise de Vilmorin represented a kind of a dream world for my mother that was so far from her own reality and her own society. And she knew some of her poems, and some of her poems were put into songs. So
How do you think she would have had contact with her? Like magazine covers or TV
magazine
programs
covers, fashion.
Or
Yes, so in order
radio
to...
shows? Like
Yes, well, Louise de Vilmorin sometimes needed to make a little money, even though she came from a rich family. She would write articles in fashion magazines.
Sure.
And my mother owned a clothing store and was really following the fashion, in Paris and all that.
Right.
So I'm sure my mother would read some articles in fashion magazines by Louise de Vilmorin as well. And eventually maybe a poem and hear a song and things like that. So she's represented that high life, but never in a snobbish way. Louise de Vilmorin enjoyed, pleasure, enjoying life. She enjoyed shopping. She enjoyed, and people criticize her for that, for being a little superficial. She enjoyed using her money, go shopping, buy some nice shoes and nice clothes.
Right.
And my mother, of course, liked that. That's why she didn't like ideology, something that would get too heavy, too serious, heavy philosophy. Because her philosophy was to enjoy life and make life enjoyable for people around her.
Not only is it a philosophy, but maybe also a sort of defense mechanism.
Yes, absolutely. There's an interview I saw of Louise de Vilmorin when one of her famous lovers, maybe the first famous lover, was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince and many other,
and a pilot
novels. And a famous pilot.
As will become relevant, someone who flies.
That's right, someone who flies.
And maybe steals.
The interviewer asked her, where did you really love Antoine de Saint-Exupéry? They got engaged, it didn't work out, the families didn't quite agree on this wedding. Somebody asked her, did you suffer from this? And did it break your heart and all that? And she said, well, I don't go there. I don't want to talk about that. So she knew tragedy was always present in her life, was always possible.
Right.
But her defense mechanism, as you were saying, was that life of pleasure that appears superficial, but as you see in her poem and in the songs of Fiançailles pour rire, anything that seems light and pleasurable, you can feel immediately the threat of something tragic that could happen. Right. And there were some tragedies in her life, but she did not want that to drag her down and to ruin her whole life. So she was very careful to protect that surface where we can live happily.
With elegance.
With elegance, yes, and taste, and yes, absolutely. Right. And a kind of an aristocratic way. Yeah.
So I think that leaves us in a good position to start diving into these poems. He set them in 1939, and in 1939 Louise de Vilmorin was in exile because she had just married.
That's right, the Count Paul Palfy.
Yeah. And so she spent, as World War II was breaking, she was separated from her family and separated from Poulenc and the Paris and the France that was so important to her. I think that there's a special tenderness that Francis Poulenc must have felt in setting her poems at this time when she was so distant from him in a time of such danger and uncertainty. Poulenc chose these 6 poems to set and start with a literary approach to the text, and then I can supplement it with how Poulenc reacts to the literary prompt of Louise de Vilmorin.
Okay.
So let's start with La Dame d'André. As you said earlier, she had many Andrés in her life. So before we talk about La Dame d'André, let's talk about who is André.
Okay, alors La Dame d'André. So one thing about this, because of what you just said, André Malraux, so there's one famous André, this dear friend and for a short time lover, but friend for life. The famous writer André Malraux said that Louise de Vilmorin was the last poet of the voice. And when you see interviews of Louise de Vilmorin, she had a way to speak that was very lively, full of energy. She would talk like that, and my dear Pierre-Nicolas, you don't know what I did yesterday. This was really incredible. She had a very, theatrical way of talking, and her voice is something to remember. So her poems are quite personal and her own voice very often, and then they go, broader than that. But La Dame d'André starts with a personal note, probably, because she had at least two very important Andrés in her life. One of them was, so we started with him, André Malraux, the very famous writer, who will become a lifelong friend and supporter, who encouraged her to write poetry in the first place. And eventually, when she died, this André Malraux, who was Minister of Culture in the French government for a long time under Charles de Gaulle, the president, André Malraux finished his life in Louise de Vilmorin's castle and died in Louise de Vilmorin's castle a few years after she died there herself. So very, very close relationship. So there's a strong possibility when she talks about La Dame d'André that this André could be this André Malraux. But she had another very important André in her life, her brother. She had 4 brothers. She loved them so much. Her favorite plant was the club, because the club has 4 leaves.
The
Trèfle.
the clover.
Clover, thank you. Club, clover.
Club on cards.
Club on cards, clover.
Yeah.
Because of the 4 leaves of the clover. And this brother was a gardener, very wealthy gardener, from a very wealthy seed company. But that was another famous André that she alludes to in her poems. But I believe in this poem, this André is André Malraux, and La Dame d'André then would be herself. I mean, you can notice that this poem, something that strikes me in this poem is the 4 stanzas are all made of syllables, of verses of 8 syllables. So it's all 8 syllables from the beginning to the end. When you see...
Could you read it?
Oh, sure, I could read it. La Dame d'André. André ne connaît pas la dame qu'il prend aujourd'hui par la main. A-t-elle un cœur à lendemain et pour le soir a-t-elle une âme? Au retour d'un bal campagnard, s'en allait-elle en robe vague chercher dans les meules la bague des fiançailles du hasard? A-t-elle peur, la nuit venue, guettée par les ombres d'hier, dans son jardin lorsque l'hiver entrait par la grande avenue? Il l'a aimée pour sa couleur, pour sa bonne humeur de dimanche. Pâlira-t-elle aux feuilles blanches de son album des temps meilleurs? So all 4 stanzas represent a question. So those are 4 questions about La Dame and this lady that André met. And the first stanza is in the present, the 2 in the middle are in the past, imparfait and passé composé. And the last one is in the future. So there's a question about the present. Who is this, the Dame d'André that he met? And then what was she doing? What was she trying to do when they met in the second and the third stanza? What is she trying to achieve in this relationship? What can he expect from her? How is this going to go? And the last stanza is about the future. What's going to happen next? So back to the 8-syllable verses. The 8-syllable verses are a sign in French of Courtoise poetry. So Middle Ages, this love poetry, courtly love poetry that appeared in France was very popular in the 12th and 13th century. And for example, the entire Tristan and Iseult, the most famous version in French is by Béroul, is entirely written in 8-syllable verses. So this poem is directly connected to this courtly love poetry and this mystery of the dame that André met, and the questions connected to this dame. Who is she? And in the future, it says he loved her for her color, for her bonne humeur, for her good spirit, and definitely, Madame.
Well, for her bonne humeur de dimanche.
For bonne humeur de dimanche.
Of
exactly.
Her Sunday good spirit.
Exactly. So this is a clear hint that this is probably about Louise de Vilmorin, because Madame Louise de Vilmorin was famous for her bonne humeur de dimanche.
And André perhaps is
André Malraux. Yes, her dear friend who convinced her to become a poet, to really be a poet.
Mm-hmm. It is rather a straightforward poem. There's not too much shadow cast in this poem. And I think in Poulenc's setting, the only shadows that are cast are on the lines of A-t-elle eu peur, la nuit venue, where he asks, is she afraid when night fell?
Yes.
And there Poulenc drops down with both hands in the bass clef and shows the shadows of the night in that moment. There's a little thing about the end here where there's a Poulenc postlude that Poulenc often has this postlude where these chords kind of stop the action and add a funny color to the end of the poem. And Georges Auric did not like the ending that Poulenc set to this poem. He wasn't convinced by it, and Poulenc defended it, saying, no, this final chord casts just the right amount of question at the end of the song. That the song doesn't close. It ends, so just like you're saying, where it starts with the present and then goes to the past and then opens into the future. Poulenc clearly captures that opening feeling. So I think as a song and as a poem, it works very well as an opening
Yes.
as an opening song, kind of a preamble.
And it's full of questions.
Full of questions
It's full
that
of
have to be
questions.
answered. Well, maybe not answered.
Maybe not answered.
Maybe
Yeah,
not
yeah.
answered. But we still have 5 songs left in the
Yes,
cycle.
yes, yes, yes.
So if we move on to Dans l'herbe, we immediately have a change of tone. If you could, read us
Okay.
Dans l'herbe.
Ok. Dans l'herbe. Je ne peux plus rien dire, ni rien faire pour lui. Il est mort de sa belle, il est mort de sa mort belle, dehors, sous l'arbre de la loi, en plein silence, en plein paysage, dans l'herbe. Il est mort inaperçu, en criant son passage, en m'appelant. Mais comme j'étais loin de lui et que sa voix ne portait plus, il est mort seul, dans les bois, sous son arbre d'enfance, et je ne peux plus rien dire ni rien faire pour lui. So this is a typical Louise de Vilmorin poem because it looks a little light but it's very serious and you can sense a bit of tragedy underneath it. So what the first thing I notice here compared to the first poem is that you don't have the 8-syllable verses here. Every single verse has a different rhythm. You know, you get 6 syllables, 5, 6, 7, 6, 4, 5, 2, 7, 6, 8, 7, 6. It's completely irregular. And for me, this goes very well with the title, Dans l'herbe, in the grass, because the grass is very irregular. It's kind of wild, you know. Some are tall, some are short. So you have this feeling in that each verse is like a leaf of grass,
Right.
in a sense. So you get this irregularity. The next thing I notice is that the first 2 verses are the exact same one as the last 2 verses.
Right.
So the entire poem is contained by these 2 verses that are kind of tragic. Those 2 verses are kind of tragic. I cannot say anything anymore, and I cannot do anything for him. I cannot say anything, I cannot do it. So that's pretty tragic.
Right.
But this, and it's strange to start a poem with the sentence, I cannot say anything. I cannot say anything anymore. And that's the first sentence of the poem. But
It's like, can you start a piece of music with a rest?
exactly.
Is it possible to start with a rest?
Exactly. But at the same time, because I cannot say anything anymore, that forces her to say something. So it's kind of a paradox. So this is talking about somebody who died while she was away, somebody who was dear to her, but there are comforting parts to that death, because this death happened in the grass. This death happened in a place where the person who died loved, under his favorite tree, in a beautiful countryside, in a park, in a place where he was comfortable, that was connected to his youth. And that's a man who died. We know it's a man who died.
Right.
And she said he died, but he died of his beautiful death. We have an expression in French when somebody dies without suffering, without major trauma. You just basically die slowly and fade away.
Right, dying in your sleep.
You die in your sleep. You die of your beautiful death. So that person died of his beautiful death, and she seems to be outside in the park. So we know Madame de Vilmorin and her brothers loved the park where they grew up, of the castle where they grew up. She loved to go there for work, for walks. I mean, not for work, maybe for work. She would have to go there for walks, and there's this strange connection to Under the Tree of the Law, which could be strange to a lot of readers. But there is a tradition, especially in aristocratic families, tradition in France that some French kings like to give justice under an oak tree. I believe St. Louis the Ninth, was the one who started this tradition. He was a king judge, and when people were fighting...
He was in the time of the Crusades, no?
He was at the time of the Crusades. He died actually in a Crusades in North Africa on the way back from the Crusades.
I remember there's a... When we visited Napoleon's tomb,
Yes.
Les Invalides,
Yeah.
on the dome above Napoleon's tomb, there is Saint Louis who is returning his sword to God.
Ah, okay.
When he
Okay.
died, there's the painting of
The
Saint
sword
Louis
going
returning
back.
his sword to God.
Yeah, yeah. So there is this French tradition of the tree of the law is an old oak tree where St. Louis used to sit to give justice, and he was in the legend, he was known as a fair king. So this death is a beautiful death connected to an old oak tree in a beautiful park. So that's the beautiful part of the beautiful death. However, you can see that she feels guilty about this because she was far away. She said, he was yelling, he was calling me, and I was not there for him. His voice could not carry far enough to reach me. He died alone in the woods. So even though it's a beautiful death, she felt guilty about it because she could not be with that person who died at that time. Right.
Certainly, for Poulenc, the idea of distance
Right.
with her was at the
Right.
forefront of how he saw her at this time.
So it's a typical poem where you see at the same time this beautiful light images, but a sense of tragedy, the tragic that is always present underneath these light, beautiful images of a beautiful death. It's kind of an oxymoron in a way. Yes.
I think going back to your idea of the irregularity of the poem, in the music, Poulenc has a very subtle and changing approach to the meter of the poem. He starts with a measure of 3/4, but the voice comes in on the end of 2, meaning 1, 2. Je ne peux plus rien dire. And then a measure of 5/4. And then another measure of 5/4, then 3/4, right? So these kinds of mixes, and throughout the poem he changes. In triple meter we usually have a strong beat followed by 2 weak beats. And there's a lot of moments in this music where he goes against, where he puts an accent either in the prosody or in the line en plein paysage, he puts an accent on the second beat to kind of highlight the poem's irregularity. So I think here Poulenc, just like in the first La Dame d'André, he responds very clearly to the regularity of the poem by giving a clear rhythmic and kind of unceasing melodic or accompaniment texture. In Dans l'herbe, he responds again to the structure of the poem through it's all quarter notes, so it is regular in a sense, but the accent pattern creates this kind of unease and this kind of noble malaise that I think is important to capture in this song. And for me, it also does end a little bit with a question, because in the last few lines of the poem, the song, the piano postlude ends with no bass. It ends with these chords very high in the keyboard, and then the lowest note is the C sharp just above middle C. So there's no bass, there's nothing holding it up, right? So the song ends, you can either see it as kind of this rising of the soul, but at any rate, we've left what holds us up. With that, I think we can move on to the third poem, very, very different in tone.
Il vole. En allant se coucher, le soleil se reflète au vernis de ma table. C'est le fromage rond de la fable au bec de mes ciseaux de vermeil. Mais où est le corbeau? Il vole. Je voudrais coudre, mais un aimant attire à lui toutes mes aiguilles. Sur la place, les joueurs de quilles, de belle en belle, passent le temps. Mais où est mon amant? Il vole. C'est un voleur que j'ai pour amant. Le corbeau vole et mon amant vole. Voleur de cœur manque à sa parole, et voleur de fromage est absent. Mais où est le bonheur? Il vole. Je pleure sous le saule pleureur, je mêle mes larmes à ses feuilles, je pleure car je veux qu'on me veuille, et je ne plais pas à mon voleur. Mais où est donc l'amour? Il vole. Trouvez la rime à ma déraison, et par les routes du paysage, ramenez-moi mon amant volage, qui prend les cœurs et perd ma raison. Je veux que mon voleur me vole.
Once again, light, fun,
Yes,
tragic
yes,
poem.
yes,
And you really have to kind of, it's not the tragedy that hits you first.
exactly. So she's kind of poking fun at herself because she's like, why all these things happen to me all the time? Why can't I hang on to one man? And it's her own choice most of the time. It's not. So that's the life she likes. The lightness triumphs. The lightness, no matter what, life keeps going. Life is stronger than but tragedy threatens.
So a quick note on the interpretation here. You do not make the liaison between mais and ou. Why?
I just decided to make it a little more dramatic, cutting after mais. Mais où est le corbeau? Mais où est mon amant? Mais où est le bonheur? I just decided to stress this mais.
Mm-hmm.
If I had not cut, I would say mais où est le bonheur? Mais où est donc l'amour?
Mm-hmm.
I think here, because of this repetition coming again and again and again, I wanted to stop and really make that mais stand out.
Mm-hmm.
Because she's playing with that. She's there is this corbeau, but where's the corbeau? And there is my lover, but where's the lover?
Right.
And there's happiness, but where is happiness? It goes again. Everything is running away. Everything is fleeting. Everything with love. That's why the Fiançailles pour rire.
Right.
She got engaged so many times. Well, she got married several times, but she got engaged, married so many times, and why can't she hold on to this? Why can't she? Why is she leaving this man? Why is this man leaving her constantly? Why is this happening all the time? So I think she really plays on that. So I made it a little more dramatic by separating the mais from everything else.
And I mentioned that just because for a singer who has to sing this song, Poulenc doesn't really give them a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Because he sets it with 2/16 notes.
No.
And the song is famously extremely fast. Poulenc himself said that this is one of my most difficult songs to play with somebody, and he said every time I do this song we have to rehearse it more than anything else. And it's so fast, and it's 2/16 notes, so it goes mizoué. And maybe mezou is not a very elegant sound, but if we go so fast, otherwise it becomes meué, and then that's just gibberish.
I would agree with that. Yes. If you go fast, it's quite acceptable. But if you don't go too fast, it sounds strange.
Right.
Mezou sounds strange.
Yeah, mezou is
Mezou et le corbeau, that's fine.
Yeah.
Mezou et le corbeau, no.
Right. Immediately in the title of the poem, we have a game.
So, yes, so this entire poem is based on the play on words in French. Voler means both to fly and to steal.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens, she was in love with two famous aviators.
Mm-hmm.
The famous André Malraux, again, who was a famous aviator. He was in the international brigades. He fought in the Spanish Civil War. Hemingway was there fighting as well in the international brigade. So he was definitely a good aviator and famous for it. And the other famous aviator in her life is the famous Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, the author of The Little Prince and many other famous novels. Well, at that time it was still sort of not the beginning of aviation, but still, the heroic time of aviation, where pilots would go for a flight and die, crash, because airplanes were not so safe. Actually, Saint-Exupéry died in a plane crash, and he was not found for, his airplane was not found for many, many years. Anyway.
In a previous conversation, you had also mentioned a game that happens with the consonants that are in the title.
Yes, so there are a lot of L's in this poem. Well, just in the title, il, vole, and clearly you have the il, vole, and the last verse also, je veux que mon voleur me vole. So this L and L is a very light vowel, very fluid vowel, and at the same time, elle, the sound L is the same for she in French.
E-L-L-E.
E-L-L-E is L. And also wings, the wings of a bird, the wings of an airplane are L, A-I-L-E.
Right.
So I think there's a wonderful, marvelous play with the letter L here for the sound, for the images, for this, coincidence. It sounds just the same as she and as wings. And yes, it's the L's are very important in there.
What would you say if this poem is flying? Certainly, as Poulenc sets the poem, it is a poem that is taking off. What is the trajectory of the poem?
So there's a progression there, because it starts like a fable. It starts like a La Fontaine fable, and she mentions the crow. C'est le fromage rond de la fable. This is clearly an allusion to La Fontaine, Le Corbeau, and the crow and the fox fable. So it starts like a fable, like a story for children. It's light, it's pleasant, but there's a serious lesson behind it. So it's very pleasurable, but there's a serious lesson behind it. So she starts with, so there is the crow that, has the cheese, but where's the crow? The crow is flying away. And then it gets a little more serious, because she talks about the magnet. And then there's another play on words, because the word magnet in French is aimant, and it's very, very similar to lover. A lover is an amant. So there's a play on word there between comparing her lover, her amant, to a magnet and aimant that attract, beautiful, beautiful things. But then she says, well, so that verse says, I would like to soar, but a magnet is stealing my needles. And then that stanza ends with, the lover, mon amant, is flying away, stealing my heart. So there's another beautiful play on words there between magnet and lover, which sound very similar in French. And then the third one gets a little more serious, because now she's not talking about the crow anymore. She's not talking about her lover anymore. She's talking about happiness. It's not really the crow that's flying away. That's not really my lover that's flying away. It's happiness itself that's leaving me. Why can't I hold on to happiness? Is it because I just want it that way? Maybe she wants it that way. And that's her decision. And then it gets a little more serious. It's not only happiness that's flying away. In the next stanza, it's love itself that's flying away, and that's stolen away from me. And in the end, she says,
almost accuses herself.
She accuses herself, yes, because she knows she's not a victim. That's the life she has chosen for herself.
Right. And
something really, really interesting you just said about the speed, that Poulenc wanted this to go really fast. Madame de
Implacable.
Implacable. That's the way she talked. Madame de Vilmorin talked super fast. She talked really fast, really fast. She was funny, she was lively, full of energy, making fun. She would tell a story. She said, somebody shut the door, vlan, and somebody, the pitcher fell from the table, boom.
With onomatopoeias.
With onomatopoeias like this.
Yeah.
She would make it really spectacular. And she would speak really fast. And so for me, this is very, very fitting of a way to talk also.
Right.
So maybe I should have read that poem faster, like Poulenc wrote the music.
Right.
And in the end, she says, je veux que mon voleur me vole. So she acknowledges that she has this life she kind of complain about, but that's the way she finds her happiness, actually.
Right.
Through this lightness, nothing becomes too heavy. Nothing becomes too heavy. Mon cadavre est doux comme un gant. Mon cadavre est doux comme un gant de peau glacée, et mes prunelles effacées font de mes yeux des cailloux blancs. 2 cailloux blancs dans mon visage, dans le silence 2 muets, ombrés encore d'un secret et lourds du poids mort des images. Mes doigts, tant de fois égarés, sont joints en attitude sainte, appuyés au creux de mes plaintes, au nœud de mon cœur arrêté. Et mes 2 pieds sont les montagnes, les 2 derniers monts que j'ai vus, à la minute où j'ai perdu la course que les années gagnent. Mon souvenir est ressemblant, enfant, emportez-le bien vite. Allez, allez, ma vie est dite. Mon cadavre est doux comme un gant.
So once again, just like in Dans l'herbe, in the heavier poem, she brackets the poem, repeating the first line
That's right.
with at the end.
That's right. That's right. So there's this beautiful frame to it with the first verb. That's one of her most famous verses that she ever wrote. Mon cadavre est doux comme un gant. It's striking.
Absolutely.
It's striking because you have something extremely heavy, mon cadavre. Can't get much heavier than that. But at the same time, she flips it around with a sign of a symbol of elegance. The gant, the glove. The same way the poem starts with the first verse and the last verse are the same, and the entire poem is framed by this first and last verse. Each stanza is structured in the same way. For each stanza, the first verse of the stanza rhymes with the last word of the stanza.
So for example, mon cadavre est doux comme un gant, and font de mes yeux des cailloux blancs.
That's right.
So gant and blanc
rhyme, and the 2 verses in the middle rhyme together. So it's this. Each stanza repeats that structure of embraced rhymes, just like the poem itself is embraced, and it gives this itself, to me, it's a connotation of this tomb also that's encasing maybe the cadavre, the box, and it works really
something
well.
that's being contained and held.
Yes. So her twist on the cadavre, she goes to medieval heraldic signs. So what she's doing there, and you can see that because the entire poem again is written in those 8-syllable verses. Every verse is 8 syllables. So she goes back to this courtly love form of poetry from medieval times. So this is more the image, when you go to a European cathedral, you have a tomb of a knight, and you see the sculpture of the knight lying on his tomb and the lady next to it. Let's say
Like in
next to it.
the Saint-Denis in Saint Denis.
Yes, like in the
cathedral where all the aristocracy and the kings are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So she's comparing her cadavre to one of these, we call it in French a gisant, a lying, knight, lying lady. This is a woman, it's probably talking about herself, her own cadavre, that she sees similarly to one of those medieval sculptures lying on their tomb, for eternity, with a little bit of humor. So it becomes very elegant. Even her cadaver becomes very elegant. It's like a glove turned inside out, very soft. And her eyes become like white little pebbles for eternity. And all this is in 8-syllable words.
For me, in the line ombre encore d'un secret is kind of talks again about La Dame d'André and the questions of La Dame d'André, and again, il vole, these kind of tragedies that are glossed over.
Yes.
So ombre d'un secret, that we're never really going to know that secret.
So I think what is behind this poem is how she feels about her death. She's not really, very dramatic about it. As we saw, she's turned it into something elegant even. But she's really sorry for everything when she's dead that she will not be able to do anymore. She loved life so much, she enjoyed life so much, she enjoyed images, she enjoys the caresses of her lovers, images of poetry, And all of that was used to be light and pleasurable will become heavy, and she really doesn't like anything heavy. So she's really afraid in the next stanza. She's really afraid of not being able to love anymore, not being able to be loved anymore. But all these memories are going to become all of a sudden, they're going to fade away and be gone. So that's what she's really sorry about, that she's going to lose this ability to love life and enjoy life. But in the end, it's not tragic at all, because she talked to children. She says, this is what my memories are like. But children, take all this away. Go. My life is gone. No, go, children, live your own life. And then she closes the poem with the lid of the first verse. So I think for me it's like this medieval tomb that she's opening and closing the lid in the end with the same verse, beautiful verse. But even in the end, she doesn't want to be tragic. She tells children, these are my memories. Take them, children, but go live your life, run away. She ends up with this image of children running, and she said, my life is said. Just like we say, mass is said. Ma vie est dite. C'est comme la messe est dite. My mass is over. My life is over. Go, children, run and play.
Right. And Poulenc's postlude definitely has a sort of surreal, moving on, the water flows kind of feeling. I always thought this sounded like it should be played by a theremin, this thing. But and one of the interesting things that I would suggest to singers is in reference to this regularity, and this is going to come back in Fleurs as well. It's so clear that the poet is taking care of the amount of syllables per line in the various poems that she's using. And I think Poulenc responds to this sometimes. The issue here being, a great example is in the first few lines of the poem, where we have the unvoiced or voiced I. Doux comme un gant de peau glacée, or doux comme un gant de peau glacée e. Right? And to maintain the poetic integrity, the literary poetic integrity, we should say doux comme un gant de peau glacée, to maintain the balance of mon cadavre est doux comme un gant, doux comme un gant de peau glacée.
That's 8.
But that's 8 syllables. And I think that people should not underestimate Poulenc's sensitivity to this, because on many of the notes that have an unvoiced E at the end, he keeps the same pitch. So on glacé, he keeps the same pitch. So you can get away with saying glacé. I gave a slight E at the end, but not much. And it doesn't add a syllable. The same thing happens on effacé. You don't have to give a strong effacé. On one of them, on image, he does change the pitch. So it's not a perfect theory, but in Fleurs we will also see that in moments where the balance of the phrase and the balance of the syllables, the balance of the prosody is important to the meaning of the poem, Poulenc keeps the same pitch, meaning that you don't have to change the vowel that you're on. A suggestion.
And definitely she did this on purpose. She worked very, very hard on her poems. She worked really hard on her poems.
And I think that Poulenc, as one of her close friends, must have been sensitive to this. And Poulenc, as such a nuanced setter of music, setter of poetry, I think it's worth considering these details of whether or not Poulenc, where does Poulenc fall on the spectrum of literary poetic rigor and vocal diction tradition. And I think that in this piece specifically, there's room to move more towards, in this set specifically, there's room to move towards the poetic literary side.
Couple amoureux aux accents méconnus, le violon et son joueur me plaisent. Ah, j'aime ces gémissements tendus sur la corde des malaises, aux accords sur les cordes des pendus, à l'heure où les lois se taisent. Le cœur, en forme de fraise, s'offre à l'amour comme un fruit inconnu.
Well, a quick biographic note
Yes.
before you say a little bit more about that. I read in the Nichols biography of Poulenc that there was a Hungarian restaurant on the Champs-Élysées that she would go with her husband,
Count Palfi.
Count Palfi, and he would invite musicians to play in this restaurant for them. So this is she's very personally implicated in
Yes.
this text.
So the poem is made of 8 verses, and 8 verses is 2 times 4, and those 8 verses 2 times 4, I'm saying 2 times 4 because they rhyme 2 by 2, and méconnu rhymes with perdu, plaise rhymes with malaise, so we have 4 couples of verses. So to me, in this Violon, she's talking about loving couples and that are unknown, and she loves the person who plays the violin for them, and the uneasiness that the violin brings to these loves as well. And then all of a sudden she makes a play on words with the strings of the violin become the strings of somebody who was hanged.
La corde des pendus.
La corde des pendus. So all of a sudden this becomes really tragic in the middle, and she brings up the law again that was mentioned earlier. But in the end, she ends again on a much lighter tone after this suggestion of very dark possibility with the string of the people who were hanged. She ends on a very light, much lighter, positive tone of
with
pleasure.
Strawberry and
with the strawberries.
The unknown fruit.
Yes. So this is typical of this uneasiness.
And sometimes in literature, and in other earlier romantic works, the violin has an association with as the devil's instrument.
That's
and
true.
The instrument
That's
of
right.
seduction, and the
That's
instrument
right.
of
right.
selling, of giving up yourself.
That's right. So there's a connections maybe between violin and love in that respect, because love as well can be really awkward, make you suffer and bring you a terrible pain, but actually it can make you so extremely happy and bring you happiness. So maybe there's a parallel between love and the violin in that case. To talk about this uneasiness and malaise that is in Madame de Vilmorin, hidden constantly under this light surface of pleasure and enjoying life. She used to say a lot, she was famous for saying that phrase, saying, "I'm a ship in distress." She had a beautiful house, she was wealthy, she had a beautiful life, a wonderful family, many lovers, you'd think she has everything to be happy, but she constantly felt like a ship in distress. And her motto as a person was help, au secours, help, au secours.
Not quite SOS, but
Not
basically.
quite yeah, not quite SOS. Because she constantly felt that need to be loved. She really needed to be loved and to seduce people. And she needed people to love her. And she would throw herself in these loves entirely. She would famously say, to some lovers, she says herself, I love you for life tonight. I love you for life tonight.
It's almost like Carmen.
It's almost like Carmen. Yeah, that's right.
Mais
That's
pas
right.
aujourd'hui, c'est certain.
Mais pas aujourd'hui, exactly.
Peut-être,
I don't know what will happen tomorrow. I don't know what will happen in a week from now. But tonight I love you for life. And here comes the violin.
Right.
So this is another little story about the strawberry, because you wonder, okay, the heart in the shape of a strawberry offers itself to love. Okay, so you say the strawberry resembles a heart, and that's the connection there.
It's red, it's the same shape.
It's red, the same shape. But there's more to it, in the sense that when she became a very serious poet, she was working so hard on her poem, she isolated herself in the Bas-Rhin, in Alsace, if you want, in the south of Alsace, in the Bas-Rhin. She went to a resort, a spa actually, and she spent almost a year there in a town called Sélestat. So when she was there, this region is known for making delicious strawberries. And she had a favorite strawberry. There are different species of strawberries. That is black. It's a beautiful black, and that was the most delicious strawberry for her. So this reference to strawberry also is connected to that time period when she isolated herself from everyone to try to write the most perfect poetry she could. But that could become also a threat and tragic.
Sure.
So her friends made her stop.
An interesting note for this song from Poulenc is that just like the La Dame d'André works very well as a poem and as a song, as an opening gesture, and he said that for the effect of this song to come off, it needs to sound like music from somewhere else, music from a distant place. And if you do this song alone, that you have to make sure to precede this song with a song that is in a very, very different key. And he says it's very important that the audience immediately recognizes that this song functions as a coda.
Fleurs promises, fleurs tenues dans tes bras, fleurs sorties des parenthèses d'un pas. Qui t'a porté ces fleurs l'hiver, saupoudrées du sable des mers? Sable de tes baisers, fleurs des amours fanés, les beaux yeux sont de cendre et dans la cheminée, un cœur enrubanné de plaintes brûle avec ses images saintes.
So right away, the first thing to say here is that the poem ends, but Poulenc adds again the first line of the text again. Poulenc continues after ces images saintes, and he goes on to fleurs promises, fleurs tenues dans tes bras, qui t'a porté ces fleurs l'hiver, saupoudrées du sable des mers. And to keep this one brief, because this one is so special that really it can say the most about itself without us explaining it. Let's just talk again about this idea of framing and syllable structure across the lines and the shape of the poem in terms of the syllables. In looking at this poem and this song, one of the interesting things for me is the idea of symmetry, and again that idea of being contained. So right in the first few measures, Poulenc has fleurs promises, and the rhythm itself is symmetrical. It's a half note, quarter, quarter, and then a half note. So it's symmetrical, it's also a palindrome, so there's that idea of equality. And again, he repeats the fleurs promises, fleurs tenues dans tes bras, and those balanced lines, he repeats it at the end and at the beginning, creating again that frame for the poem. So for me, there's this idea of resolution and containedness and kind of not going over the top here in the expression.
So for me, what stands out in this poem is we have 8 syllables again, and each verse are assembled in couples, but they follow each other like 1 and 2 rhyme together, 3 and 4 rhyme together. So they're arranged in pairs, in couples. So there seems to be some kind of a reconciliation. Also, every verse is as an even number. The first 2 verses are 10 syllables. The second one are 8 syllables, and the 1 and 2 are 10, 10. Then it's 8, 8. Then it's 12, 12, an alexandrin, and she ends with 8, 8. This courtly love rhythm. According to different centuries in French poetry, there were different rhythms that were popular. In the 12th, 13th century, the 8-syllable courtly love was tend to be the noble rhythm, and then there were more 10 syllables coming, and then in the 17th century, with the famous classical Greek tragedies, the noble verse was 12 syllables, the alexandrin. And so in this poem, she uses all those different colors of poetic tradition of the 12th, 13th century, of the 15th, 16th century, and on the 17th century. But they're all even numbers. So even numbers make me think of, you can divide them by 2, and every verse goes 2 by 2. And when you think of Fiançailles and love, all this attempt to find love and happiness 2 by 2, each verse here goes 2 by 2 in even numbers. So there is this longing for something that goes 2 by 2, couples, something stable in all these traditions of different rhythms of 10, 8, 12, 8 syllables, ending with courtly love, the 8-syllable verse. And in there, the main topic being Fleurs. Of course, when you think of Fleurs, you think of all the different meanings and traditions connected to flowers. And she was very aware of that. And you see different kinds of loves that are brought up by these different flowers. The flowers that were promised to me, the flowers.
Right. Flowers for marriage, and also flowers for death or funeral.
Flowers for death, for funeral, yes. All kind of flowers you get at different time, and flowers you offer because you're far away from someone, and you send flowers from far away. That's alluded to in the middle of the poem. So all those different kinds of loves represented are those different kinds of flowers, and in the end, there is this kind of heraldic, medieval image of holy images in the end. This brings you back to those images of her childhood as a young aristocratic woman, that you had those imageries of the saints in heaven, in eternal happiness and all that. But there's the image of fire before that her heart, all wrapped up in complaints, is burning with these holy images that are turning into smoke in the end. So I see in this poem also a longing for all these engagements, that she ended up her life by herself, surrounded with dear friends, but she got tired of getting married after a while and never remarried. She had still many lovers, but that big love never came in the end, even though she was really in love many times.
Right. And I think Poulenc treats her and her poem with the utmost elegance and nobility. We again have this typical Poulencian regularity of accompaniment, of just all quarter notes. There is not a single beat in the song that does not have a quarter note. There's not a single eighth note in the song. Everything is controlled and contained, and the colors of the harmonies are gorgeous. And once again, I would draw the interpreter's attention to when he messes with the structure of the poem, or with the structure of the accent pattern. The song is in 3/4, but there are measures of 2/4. There are some measures of 4/4 even, And once again, we have this story of, you just gave such a great explanation of how important the amount of syllables are in each line, of how everything is balanced. The opening line is 10 syllables. The opening 2 lines are 10 syllables. The next 2 are 8. The next 2 are 12, right? And I would add that the reason why Poulenc adds the first line at the end, again, shows that symmetry, because then we have 10, 8, 12, 8, 10 again at the end. So it gives this nice, controlled, balanced approach to the song. And I would once again implore the singer to consider not pronouncing their unvoiced E's. So something like fleurs sorties, I would not say fleurs sorties, because it adds one syllable too many to an otherwise perfectly balanced line of poetry. Another one would be les beaux yeux sont de cendre. How much of a syllable should you make on cendre?
None, because so there are things you
Another
cannot
one,
do in literature.
Well, no, but I would say et dans la cheminée.
No.
Right?
Yeah,
All of these
in literature you would never say that. But
all of these things, Poulenc specifically keeps the same pitch. If he changed pitch, you would need to change the vowel. And since he keeps it on the same pitch, I think that there's room to, and this might make some people upset, but I think there's room, in light of how sensitive Poulenc is to the poetry, there is room to not say the unvoiced consonant, the unvoiced vowel, when he keeps the same pitch, in order to preserve the integrity of the poem's structure.
For me, what's behind what you said is that the notion of musicality in literature and in music are very different sometimes. There are some things in musicality in literature that you cannot do and you don't do according to the French poetic tradition.
Right.
But when you're a musician, musicality sometimes means something different, and it's for the musician to decide. And that's, I think, what you explained, that you constantly have to make those decisions as a musician. Whereas in literature, it's decided. You cannot say cendre, you cannot say cheminée, you cannot say fané.
Right. It's simply,
no.
it's as bad as playing a wrong note.
Yeah, it's as bad as playing a wrong note. It would be horrible. But again, musicality in literature sometimes means something a little different from musicality in music.
Of course.
Yeah.
So I think that can conclude where we are with the Fiançailles pour rire. What strikes me after having a brief period away is just the elegance and the fact that, sometimes when we're wearing ties, because you said we cannot speak about Louise de Vilmorin without a tie on. And with Louise de Vilmorin, I never feel that she unbuttons this top button. She always, in her poetry, in the way she expresses herself, it's never stuck up, but it's always put together, and always, there's never this heart on sleeve feeling.
For people who loved her, she embodied elegance, but never in a stuffy way, never in a dominating way, never. She embodied elegance as just an important way to enjoy life, and to enjoy the light side of life itself, the pleasures of everyday life. That's the kind of elegance she represented, in the way she spoke, in the way she addressed people, in the way she treated people.
Right. There's a portrait of Poulenc. Earlier tonight we mentioned Pierre Bernac, Poulenc's longtime collaborator and friend. And there's a portrait of Poulenc sitting at the piano, clearly having a good time, and Bernac is standing over him. They're both wearing tuxedos with the tails, looking very, very elegant. And Poulenc inscribes under the portrait, le contentement de soi. And Poulenc himself shared this value of Louise de Vilmorin of feeling good in yourself and enjoying life. The more you look at these two characters, the more you understand why there is such a good result in Poulenc setting poetry of Louise de Vilmorin.
Yeah. She was very serious about being light.